Welcome.
To today's program. My name is Glenn Deason. I'm a professor of political science, more specifically, Russian foreign policy. With me today is the excellent Colonel Douglas,
Macgregor.
decorated combat veteran, author of 5 books, and former advisor to the Trump administration. Great to see you again.
Good to see you, Glenn.
Well, what I want to talk about today is always hardly an exaggeration to suggest now that we may be entering a third world war, unfortunately. Personally, I was convinced that pursuing a proxy war with Russia, the world's largest nuclear power, would be the peak of recklessness. But of course, we're also having a possible war with China, as the One China policies dismantled. But more pressing now is, of course, another war beginning in the Middle East over NASA. So I really wanted to focus on the Middle East today because, well, I guess in the past, in the Middle East, the US and all collective West largely had escalation control. There's Target 1, while the other states could be deterred from joining in. But the West, and including the US, is somewhat weaker now, and the Middle Eastern states have grown more powerful. Also, this war and the destruction of gas is something very different, I think, from the previous wars. So I was just wondering, how do you read the situation? Has Israel and the United States overplayed their hand, or have they walked into something they can't control? What do you see the strategy being and the risks, of course?
Well, whenever a nation-state involves itself in conflict, they need to immediately shed the illusion of control. It's very difficult to foresee all circumstances, and that's why even the best strategist recognizes that goals and objectives have to adapt and change. I think the problem we have right now with both the government in Israel and the government in the United States is there really is no strategy per se. The Israelis are reacting to the events of 7th of October, and I don't know of anyone anywhere who disagrees with the assertion that these acts were horrific and atrocious in every sense of the words. However, 3.5 weeks later, we're now watching as over 8,500 people in Gaza have been killed, of which at least 3,500 are children. As I communicated to a friend in the Israeli Defense Force, I said, everybody understands the need to eradicate Hamas. The question is, first of all, can it be done under the circumstances? Is it realistic to do that? Then secondly, how has Israel's case helped? When with each passing day, whatever memory there is of the horrific acts of Hamas against Israeli citizens is gradually erased by new horrific acts in Gaza, caused by Israeli fire, largely airstrikes, but also some ground fire. I don't think there's an understanding of that right now. There's the view that there are no such things as civilians. Those are just combatants. If they don't want to be combatants, then they should leave and go somewhere else. But we know that there are at least 500,000 people located inside northern Georgia, because that's where they live, and they really have nowhere else to go. Many have decided that they'd rather die at home in dignity than die in the desert somewhere. I don't think that particular set of circumstances really helps Israel's case at all, but I understand why the Israelis feel the way they do. The problem now is that in the United States, for many, many years, I would say decades, there has been a careful cultivation of not just support for Israel, but the readiness to effectively do whatever the Israelis think is appropriate. In other words, unconditional support for Israel without much question. This is a combination, I think, of two things. One is certainly money that is poured into the pockets of politicians on the Hill and into presidential campaigns by Israeli supporters who want to ensure that whatever we do, we always support Israel. And on the other hand, I think there's also the role that is played by Christian evangelists who are convinced that they have a holy obligation to fight for or support Israel. But the truth is, we do have an obligation to think about the United States and its interests. I don't think we're giving that much thought at this point. Our war stocks are exhausted. We've shipped almost everything we possibly could to the Ukrainians in terms of ammunition, along with a great deal of equipment. Our own forces are much smaller than they were in 1991. Yet, there is this underlying assumption in everything that we do in Washington that we are largely unchanged from the nation of 1991, that our armed forces are effectively the same. They are not. We don't have much depth in our forces. In Israel's case, the Israelis are going to be supported by us almost entirely by naval and air power. We don't have the thousands of aircraft, fighters that we once had. We don't have hundreds of bombers. Our inventories of missiles are not endless. There has to be some thought about what the means and ends are. By the way, if we're supporting the Israelis as we want to, are they doing things that would inadvertently bring us into conflict with other nations that, frankly, we don't necessarily want to fight? Where is our end in all of this? In other words, we want to support Israel. We want Israel to exist. I certainly sign up for that. But how much more do we want to do than simply help Israel defend itself? We're now about to do a great deal more potentially, given the numbers of forces at sea that we've got in the Eastern Mediterranean, the high probability that we will send even more probably to the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and that these naval forces could be used against forces that are not necessarily involved in the confrontation with Hamas. I don't think people have thought all of this through. The other thing is that there's an assumption that nothing has changed in the Middle East. If we go back to 1973, and I remember that very vividly, I was a cadet at West Point. We ultimately followed what was happening in 1973 because people that were instructing us, officers told us, if the Israelis should collapse and the Egyptians or the Syrians should break through and move into the heartland of Israel, we could well be called upon to deploy and rescue the Israelis from destruction. Now that didn't happen. Fortunately, the Israelis were able to master the situation. Today is different. The forces that the Israelis face are far more sophisticated, more complex. The populations in the region have changed insofar as they are more educated, more capable. There is new technology, new ways of waging war, and new actors on the scene. It's not just Iran, which is in its own right a large regional power. It's also Turkey, which, as you know, as a NATO member, has the largest armed forces in NATO just after the United States. And as far as its army is concerned, it has a different force from us and could mobilize 2 million men in the space of 30 to 40 days. So Turkey is a force to be reckoned with at sea, in the air, and on the ground. And there appears to be a willingness on the part of the Sunni Muslim Turks to actually cooperate with the Shia, Persians, and Arabs, which has not been the case in the past. So the region strategically has evolved, and I don't think people are taking that into account. So if this war would expand by other actors getting involved, how would you see the most likely scenario playing out? Because I got the impression that the Biden administration was pulling a little bit back after the meeting with Egypt, because it looked for a while that the U.S. and Israel might be pushing the entire CASA population, or cleansing it out of CASA pushing it into the of Egypt. But after the meeting with Egypt, it appears that the U.S. was committing itself to not displacing the population out from CASA. So but still, there's so many ways for this to escalate. How do you see this possibly going moving forward? Because the Israelis will definitely continue into CASA. Who's going to join in first? Will it be West?